Did you feel a sense of kind of pressure and responsibility knowing that, you're one of very few women on the radio at the time? Did you kind of feel that like people were looking to you as I guess some kind of, trailblazer and a leader, or did you just kind of take it all in your stride? What were your thoughts?
Yeah. No, look, I've never really thought like that ever. Um, I always felt that if somebody wanted to know how to do what I was doing, I would show them. And I did have a number of people who rang me and they were really genuine and they wanted to learn how to do radio well. And I thought, well, seeing as how I've, had the success that I've had, then I guess I must know what I'm talking about. So I would share it with them. But I never felt a sense of competition ever. And the guys would say to me, "You're nuts. Everyone wants your job." It's like, well, if they want my job and they're better at doing it than I am, they can have it.
Hmm.
And they didn't actually work out like that. But yeah, I was definitely not threatened in any way by that.
Did you any interviews or conversations that you've had over the years that have, I don't know, that have been really influential and stayed with you?
Oh, loads, loads, loads. Um, I remember speaking with Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Oh, man, that was so much fun talking to him. That was incredible. And I got to talk to people like UB40, and there was a guy called Benny Mardonis who had one hit, and I spoke with him, and he gave me his grandma's recipe for tomato sauce, which was really wonderful. And I use it, and it works. It's a magnificent recipe. And then there was I spoke with Frank Zappa, and he found it, and he decided that he wanted to have some of my scrambled eggs at one stage. So that was pretty interesting. Who else? I was on air when Australia won the America's Cup. That was
Oh, wow.
phenomenal. What a morning. Yeah. And Bob Hawke got on the radio and told everybody that if their boss wouldn't let them have the rest of the day off, they were a bum.
Yeah.
And I was also on air when the Ash, is that what they were? Wednesday fires went through Victoria in 1983.
Mhm.
And the music playlist that I had at the time was just awful. So I had to drop most of the songs that I'd been given. Well, it had things like Fire by the Pointer
Yes.
Sisters and I'm on Fire and, all these other, it was like, no, I can't certainly play those. Particularly back in those days, there was no mobile phones. There was two-way radio and most of the telephones were, by wires. So there were telephone poles that had been burnt down and there were communities that nobody had any idea whether they'd survived or whether they'd been burnt. It was a horrendous night, actually, a very frightening night. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
so
I
you
remember
had
being
to
on air for that.
essentially be like that middleman, like trying to get information
Well,
out, but
whatever information I could get out,
yeah.
and there wasn't much coming through. And the thing is, of course, I was in Melbourne, and these fires were happening on the other side of the Dandenong. So, whatever I had to say probably wouldn't have got to the people who were desperate for information. So, yeah, I was on air. This was amazing when the Sky Shuttle, no, Skylab fell out of the sky.
Oh!
So this was when I was in Western Australia, and in the middle of all of the phone calls I was getting from the United States and all over the world, England, whatever, people wanting me to give some sort of commentary because they couldn't get to where it actually was, which was in the southwest of Western Australia. And so I had to change turntables. So I remember taking these phone calls and unplugging the turntable and moving it to the other studio and getting the other, and yeah, because it was a pretty big deal, And then after that, the guy that had actually found it was flown to the United States and treated like a superhero, and given so much stuff just because he was the first person to find it. So that
Wow.
was a lot of fun too, following all that story.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
very cool.
Mm.
Now, Jen, you stayed in radio for how many years? How long?
25 years I was in radio, yeah. Well, actually, it's a bit of a fuzzy area when my radio career kind of like, and I don't even want to say that it finished because when I was caring for my mother in her last days, I was actually asked by Sunshine FM in Perth to go back on air for a few weeks. So that was a bit of fun. Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know whether my career has finished yet.
Oh, never say never, I say. You
Yeah.
did make the switch though from radio to teaching. Why
Yes.
the career move?
Well, so again, going back a few years now, so when I became a Christian, I was working at 96 FM, which is a very rock and roll radio station,
And this
loving
is
it.
it was this in Melbourne?
No, this is in Perth.
This is in Perth.
So I spent 5 years at 6 PM, then I was brought to Melbourne. I spent 5 years at Eon FM, and then after my son was born, I went back to Perth because I wanted him to grow up with knowing aunties, uncles, grandmas, and grandpas, because that's something I didn't have when I was a kid. My mother came from Scotland, my father came from Sydney, and we were just one little family by ourselves in Perth. Um, and then I worked at a couple of uh, public radio stations. Also worked in at the AM stations in Perth, and then 96 FM. And
So you were just
being
working at like literally every radio station in Perth at this point.
yeah, on one day I can't remember exactly when it was. I worked at 3 radio stations in one 24-hour period.
Did you accidentally say the wrong station ID at any time?
Oh, yes, and
Yeah.
also the other thing too is that when I worked at Sunshine FM, I was Davina Laddams, because Davina is my middle name, Laddams is my married name, and when I worked at the other stations, I was Jan Cannon, see, so
Oh,
and I said the wrong name on the wrong radio station a couple of times. I was like,
it's
"Oh
like
my
you got a
gosh,
secret
who am
identity there.
I? Where am I? What am I doing?" Yeah, so, yeah, and I actually joined Amway, and Amway taught me a whole bunch of ideas about what's involved in being a successful person. And what they used to ask you to do, or I suppose they still do, is listen to one of their positive motivational tapes every day, and also read 15 minutes of a positive mental attitude book. And I got into that in a big way. I really loved it, and it really did change my life. And the thing I noticed about the PMA books was that a lot of them were Christian based. And I loved the wisdom that I was being exposed to in those books. And I wished that I'd grown up with that kind of wisdom. So I became more and more a follower of Christ. And then eventually one day under a gum tree, I gave my heart to the Lord, turning my back on my tradition because my mother was Jewish, and at the time, my father was an atheist, and they just both thought I was, having a bit of fun. But no, I was very serious, because
Mm.
here I am 33 years later. And and then I started to notice the lyrics and things like that in the songs. And then the other thing that happened too was that 96 FM was bought by a consortium from the eastern states. It was an us and them thing. We're in the west, and the eastern states are on the other side of the country, and they can't tell us what to do. Anyway, and then I got and the first thing that they did was that they got rid of everything that equated with the old 96 FM, and I was one of the first cabs off the rank. So suddenly I found myself without a job. I didn't stay unemployed for very long. I went to 94.5, but in the meantime, I tried to get a job as a teacher's assistant, and I was overqualified for that because I had a Bachelor of Arts, but I didn't have a Diploma of Education. So they wouldn't employ me as a teacher's assistant. I tried to get a job as a receptionist after all the phone calls I'd answered, and no, I didn't have the right qualifications for that either. And so then I thought, well, you know what? I'll go and finish off my teaching degree. And that's what I did. I got into an early childhood teaching degree, and it was a 1-year Diploma of Education. And man, I've never worked so hard in all my life. I was doing late night love songs on 94.5, and I do the whole love song thing. And then as soon as I turned off the microphone, I'd be colouring in different resources for in the classroom and all that sort of stuff. And by the end of the year, I was fully qualified. And so then I started doing relief teaching. I thought I'd rather do relief and kind of get used to the idea of what's involved in being a good teacher than just jump in hollis bolus. So I did that for about 18 months. And in the meantime, I picked up a job with information radio. And then eventually after that, Sunshine FM asked me to come and work for them. And so I was still doing relief teaching as well as working at Sunshine. And the problem was that back in the day, they didn't have a lot of income. And so sometimes at the end of the week, they would say to us, sorry, we can't pay you this week, but we can give you a box of vegetables. And they'd be
Ugh.
like, okay, it's cost me quite a bit of money to drive to the radio station each day to present my show. And unfortunately, they don't give away petrol. And I have 2 children, and I have a mortgage, and I have a husband, and, I need to get something that's gonna give me some money. So, I started taking my teaching career a little bit more seriously and eventually became a full-time teacher, teaching in the northwest of Western Australia in the Kimberley. Eventually, I became what's known as a level 3 teacher, which meant that I could administer schools as well as teach. And so I was a principal of a tiny little community called Nullabidder. Closest shop was 190 kilometres away.
Wow.
And yeah, I
How'd you
stomped
get your
around and
groceries?
well, used to go into Broome once a fortnight, and I would buy enough stuff to keep me going for a couple of weeks, you know. And I would always buy hard vegetables like, you know, potatoes and pumpkins and cauliflowers and cabbage and stuff like that because there was, you know, I was in the desert and there was, I used to try and grow, you know, sprouts and stuff like that, but it's pretty harsh. I mean, each day was well and truly over 45 degrees. So that's in the summertime. And
Wow.
it was very, very dry in the winter. So, yeah. But yeah, so I did that. I kept on teaching for a while. Eventually became a mathematics consultant, and you know, flew around Australia teaching teachers how to teach mathematics. And then my parents started to decline, and so I decided to look after them. And I started teaching at Edith Cowan University and Curtin University as well. And then when they passed away, I went back up to a little tiny community called One Arm Point, which is so named because somebody had their arm bitten off by a crocodile. And
Oh,
gorgeous place, though, amazing place. And then after that, I taught again in the desert. And then I got a phone call from New Zealand telling me that my 4 grandchildren had no one to look after them, and could I help in any way? And of course, I just dropped everything and went. And I've been there for 3 years now.
oh,
Mm,
fantastic. So right in the
mm.
middle of COVID.
Yeah,
So
well, just before actually,
before COVID.
because
Yeah.
what they said to me was, "Come over for 3 months, we'll get everything sorted out, and you can take the kids back to Australia." And then COVID happened, and it was actually nearly 3 years before I was able to get back out again. Mm.
Wow. Wow. How's the experience been of looking after your grandkids? I imagine it must be difficult but rewarding.
Oh, yeah, it would have to be the most rewarding thing I've ever done. And the thing is that it I really believe it's God's calling on my life. And of course, the way I've always sort of decided that I will always be a lifelong learner. So I've thrown myself into this and learnt as much as I possibly can about how children show that they're traumatized and how to help them to overcome it, and live positive, productive, and good lives. Um, because you know when they've been traumatized, they get pretty badly messed up, and they do behaviours which, you know, ultimately, if someone doesn't actually show them a better way, it leads them to, you know, being incarcerated, and a terrible cycle is started. So I believe that my 4 are going to be okay.
Mm.
Actually, my claim to fame in New Zealand, I've already got one.
Oh,
Last last year, I was named Carer of the Year, and I got a beautiful presentation from the Governor General of New Zealand. So
oh,
I can't help
fair.
myself, you know.
Oh, that
Uh,
is so wonderful, and I'm
yeah.
sure so well deserved. So
Oh,
well
thank you.
deserved.
Yeah.
I can imagine you've had to lean on God, especially the last couple of years, but throughout your 33 years as a Christian, possibly even before that. How have you lent on God in your life?
All right. So here's the thing, right? Before I became a Christian and before I even was walking with God, um, people would say, "You've got an incredible voice." And I would say, "Look, honestly, it's got nothing to do with me. It's God given." So I acknowledge God even when I didn't really have a relationship with Him. Um, and then after I became a Christian, actually, yeah, because when a boat is heading towards an iceberg and you have to turn it around, it's really hard work. And you know, I had to turn my life around because I was living in a very destructive kind of a way. And so I really lent into his word. I learnt a lot of memory verses. I went to church. I went to Bible studies. I learnt as much as I possibly could. And then what I eventually found out was that I had a lot of head knowledge, but not so much heart knowledge. And I think what's happened now is that over the last few years, God has shown me who he is in the person of Jesus Christ. I mean, the thing is like that, I was a Christ follower, but in terms of really knowing Jesus, in terms of like being able to think like he thinks, to be able to make good decisions as he would, and that sort of stuff, to have the mind of Christ is what my quest has been. And it's happened in lots of funny ways. So before I took over the role with my children, with my grandchildren, I had signed up for a road trip across the United States on Route 66. And it was a real blast. And one of the things that I got to do was go to Memphis and sit in the church of the Reverend Al Green. And on that particular day, he was preaching about one day at a time, sweet Jesus. That's all I'm asking from you. And that really spoke to me. It was like, yep, because songs always speak to me. So it was like, yep, that's how I'm going to live my life now, one day at a time. I'm not going to worry about the future. I'm not going to dwell or stew about the past. I'm just going to take each day as it is. And all I can do is do my best. So even if my best is by other people's standards not all that great, doesn't matter. It was my best. And then the next song that I came across was when I first got to New Zealand, I went to church, and that song, Hillsong, there is another in the fire. So I know that I'm not alone. And the verse that keeps me going is that all things are working together for the good of those who believe in him and have been called according to his purpose, Romans 8:28. Yeah, because sometimes I think to myself, what the bleep is happening? And then the other one that really helps me, a lot is I think about Psalm 1. Psalm 1 is such an encourager for me, so I just try to stay planted in God as much as I possibly can, let those living waters just fill me up. So, yeah,
Mm. You
that's
said at the beginning.
how I do it, songs, lots of good Christian music, worship, surround myself with good, strong Christians. God has been so good in that way. And, yeah, stay connected.
What does being a Christian mean to you? What does that look like for you?
Excuse me. Well, see, I don't actually call myself a Christian. I call myself a Christ follower because lots of people call themselves Christians, and sometimes I wonder where their walk is.
Mm.
But I actually um, like to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. I like to, like I said, develop the mind of Christ. Be rebuked by him when I've done the wrong thing. Be encouraged by him when I'm on the right path. And that all comes through in different ways. It comes through in the voices of my sisters and brothers in Christ. It comes through in the songs that I listen to. Sometimes a line in a song will just stand out to you. When I'm reading the Bible, how sometimes a verse just jumps off the page at you. These are the kinds of things where I know that God is directing my path. That Proverbs, 3, 5, and 6. I just hand it all to him and ask him to make my path straight, and he does it. He will never leave us or forsake us. He goes before us, he's behind us, he's above us, he's below us, he's everywhere. So yeah, for me, that's being a Christ follower. Total faith, total trust.
What a great note to end on. Jan Cannon, it has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing so much of yourself and your story on the podcast today. I really appreciate your wisdom and your time.
Thank you, Georgia. It's been a pleasure.